my work in obesity that has led me into happiness. So I did a master's degree and 2 years of a PhD studying childhood obesity. And once I learned that you could study happiness, I thought that's amazing. And essentially, in a childhood obesity intervention, you want to establish healthy habits in children so that they can grow up to be healthy. Because when kids start to engage in healthy behaviors when they're younger, they're more likely to engage in them when they're older. And with happiness interventions, when people are happier, they tend to make better health choices too. And so I just thought happiness is much more inclusive. It has nothing to do with the number on a scale. It's relatable to every single person. And it's something that, the research is really clear that it can have a meaningful impact on our health, on how we perform at work, in our relationships, in so many areas of our life.
On the research that you were alluding to, what are some small, but maybe mighty, science-backed habits that bring people joy, even during very difficult times? And maybe you can add a little twist to help elevate some of those that might be very particular to our community.
It's really interesting because when we think about what are the things that make us happy, and I'm constantly asking people that because that's what I do. And a lot of times people will say, the trip that I just went on, or the new car that I have, or those sort of things. But what we know from research is that it's really not about the big moments in our life that bring us the most amount of happiness. But we think that they do, because as humans, we think we're like these logical, rational creatures. But the reality is our brain can play tricks on us, and we have these cognitive biases in our head. And so one of them that was first coined by Dan Gilbert at Harvard, it's called affective forecasting. So forecasting our affect, sort of predicting how we're going to feel. And what his research shows is that we're not as good at predicting what it is that makes us happy. So say you get the car, the job, the partner, whatever it is. What we see when we actually measure it is two things. One, it doesn't bring you as much happiness as you anticipate that it would. And two, that happiness doesn't last for nearly as long as you think that it would. And so then the question becomes, okay, well, if it's not those big things that make us happy, then what is it? And so there's a researcher, her name is Dr. Barbara Fredrickson. She proposed this theory in 1998 that kind of like revolutionized the psychology world. So it's kind of mind-boggling to think, but up until 1998, the way people thought in psychology was, say you're going through like a really hard time, you experience loss or grief or a health issue. The prevailing theory up until then was that you had to sort of go through that difficult time, feel the grief, feel the sadness, whatever those emotions that are coming up are. And then sort of the prize, like the light at the end of the tunnel, was that once you got through that, then you got to feel joy or, delight or things like that again. And when she proposed this theory, and she called it the broaden and build theory. And so what she showed was that, especially when we're going through hard or difficult times, focusing on these micro moments of joy or happiness or, whatever makes us feel good, it's really important because it broadens our skill set and our repertoire to seek out resources, to build capacity, to build resilience, to build psychological flexibility. And the really big thing about this work was that she really focused on micro moments. And those are, when we think about how do I live a happy life, what does that look like? Really focusing on these micro moments, which the thing about them is because they're micro, they don't take up as much time in our brain, right? Like, having a conversation with a friend, going like today in Toronto, it's absolutely beautiful. Going outside for a walk and feeling the sun on your face, right? These small little micro things. But when you actually add up all of those things, that adds up to a lot more happiness than the big shiny moments. And the other thing is, I sort of think about happiness like a muscle, right? And so if you want to get strong, then say you want to get strong biceps, right? You have to go to the gym and do bicep curls or whatever exercise. But if you go to the gym and you do one, it doesn't change your life. But if you consistently go rep after rep over time, you get stronger. And so these micro moments are sort of like these little reps that we do that build our happiness muscle. And then over time, it increases our happiness. And the other thing is that I think it's really important to know that a happy life doesn't mean that hard things don't happen. A happy life doesn't mean that we don't face challenges or difficulties. But when we focus on strengthening that muscle, it's like if you were to plot it on a graph, it's like our highs get high. And it's not that those hard or difficult things go away, but they get higher too because we are more resilient and better able to cope with those hard things when they happen. And so the other thing I really like about this is that, we can all look at our day today and say, what's one thing that I can do to create a micro moment, right? It's something that is manageable. It's not overwhelming. And to know that those, micro things, I always try not to use the word small because I don't mean small in terms of impact, but I mean small in terms of time or effort, right? But those micro things, they matter, and they matter a lot. Before I sort of define happiness, one of the similar adjacent questions I get asked a lot is like, what's the difference between happiness and joy? Or, happiness and contentment? The definition that I use, which is one that's commonly used in the happiness research, is that happiness has two components to it. So it has an affective component, like how we're feeling, but it has a cognitive component as well. And so what distinguishes happiness from other things like joy, contentment, peace, elation, delight, is that is an affective experience, right? It's how we're feeling. It changes our mood and what we experience. So that is one part of happiness. But what distinguishes happiness from those things is that it also has this cognitive component, this sort of overall, if I zoom out on my life, how do I feel? Life satisfaction is sometimes the term that we use in research, but it's sort of like generally overall, I feel like my life is pretty good. So it's sort of like happiness is two pieces, right? Joy, contentment, positive well-being, those good feelings. But it also has the experience that my life is meaningful, that my life is good, that my life is worthwhile. So that's sort of what distinguishes in the research. Now, we also can measure sort of momentary happiness, which would be the same as like measuring joy or measuring how we're feeling in the moment, like a snapshot. But overall, when we research happiness, we sort of have those two components together that collectively give us a picture. Because if you think about it, you can feel like your life is pretty good overall and be having a really bad day, right? We all have bad days. And just to be very clear, I am a happiness researcher and I am not happy all the time because research actually shows that one, it's impossible to be happy all the time. And two, what we see is that people who try to be happy all of the time end up being less happy than other people.
Wow.
And when I first read that research, I was kind of confused because I was like, if you're trying to be happy all the time and, you don't reach the goal, like at least you're kind of like trending in the right direction is how I thought about it. Right. But then I thought about what happens when we don't reach our goals, right? If someone was to take like a microphone and put it in our head and people hear the way we speak to ourselves, we would never speak to other people the way that we speak to ourselves sometimes, right? And so what researchers find is that it's not about setting the goal of happiness all of the time. It's about what they call prioritizing positivity. So making it something that is a priority in our life, but isn't a necessary condition all of the time. And it also makes sense too, like if you think about it, if you have experienced loss of a loved one or a pet, does happiness in that moment make sense? No, absolutely not. And so I think that there's this really important piece of knowing that we're not designed to be happy all the time, because when we know that, that gives ourselves grace and compassion to be a human. And when we look in terms of healthy psychological functioning, it's really about experiencing the full range of the emotional experience. It's really about having and opening up. And it's paradoxically, when we open ourselves up to allow all of those feelings, that we end up seeing that those people end up being happier than other people.
Next question. For someone feeling overwhelmed or stuck, what's the simplest first step they can take today to begin shifting towards greater well-being?
That's a horrible feeling when you're feeling stuck or unmotivated or overwhelmed too. Sometimes when you have so much on your plate, you don't know where to start. I experience that myself as well. And so then when I'm experiencing those moments, I have to like put on my researcher hat and like talk to myself in the third person, which by the way is there's research that shows that if you're going through a hard time, if you talk to yourself in the third person, it can actually be more beneficial, because it's almost like you sort of would talk to yourself more like you would talk to a friend versus the internal self-talk and self-dialogue that we have. So I know that research. So I'm like, okay, Jillian, talk to yourself in the third person. You know the data. What do you do? And so one of the things is I think when we're feeling really stuck or down or overwhelmed, everything just feels so daunting that we just don't even know where to start. And then we think about the big things, and it feels almost like an impossible task or feat, right? And so I even had this when I was starting to write my PhD about happiness. I was so overwhelmed. I didn't know where to start. And it was something I'd never done before. I'd never written a PhD. I didn't know how to do it. And so on the first day, all I did was I made a title page because I know what they look like, my name, the university, the title, the date, my supervisor. That's all I did for the day. And the next day, I did one more thing. And so it's really breaking it down into small, manageable chunks and trying to focus more on that versus the big picture, especially at the beginning. One, because if you just think, what is the one thing or the smallest thing that I can do today? It makes you take action. And any type of action is movement in the right direction. And then what we also see is that starts to build momentum. It starts to build self-confidence. It starts to bring accomplishment. So the term for it in research, sometimes we call it is like milestoning, right? So you look at not what's the end goal, but what are all the steps along the way? And if you don't even know all the steps along the way, that's okay. Like, I don't know all the steps along the way to write a book, but I do know, I can sit down and put words on pages and start to collect my thoughts. And so you just keep taking that next step. Another fun term that's sometimes used is pebbling, like little pebbles, like you're building a little path. And I think, especially with happiness, like I feel like we think the boulders, like the big things are the big things, but really the road to happiness is paved in little pebbles. And to do those little small things, again, we're back to this micro moment, this micro thing, because it's so impactful. And so it's really asking, okay, what's the next step? And then the other thing that I think is really key is so often we're focused on goal accomplishment that we don't celebrate along the way, right? So take that next step and celebrate those things, because that also, one, brings you recognition. It helps you to see what you've accomplished, and that can start to build more momentum, more confidence. It brings sort of more joy to the process sometimes. I wish I would have measured my happiness when I first started researching happiness, because I feel like I'm happier now, but I don't have the data to support that. So it's completely anecdotal. But what I have learned is that when we talk about like the tools and strategies that we can use to sort of build that happiness muscle, I try all of the things I read in my research, right? I do an experiment on myself. And so with resilience in particular, so resilience is our ability to bounce back. It actually comes from an engineering term with like rubber that would bounce back. And so resilience is when a hard or difficult thing happens, what do I do? How do I, overcome the challenge, navigate through a difficulty? But the other interesting term that comes up in psychological research is this concept of thriving or flourishing. So resilience is the ability to bounce back. But I would be willing to bet that every single person on this call doesn't want to just bounce back. We want to take those difficult things and learn from them and use them to cultivate our confidence, to grow strength, to build our self-esteem. And so resilience is bouncing back to baseline and then going above and beyond that, this thriving, flourishing, because life is hard sometimes, right? And we all face hard things. And so it's not about not having them. It's about how do we deal with them? How do we navigate? How do we cope?
Final question, and that is, how can community and connection support sustainable happiness? What role does belonging play in how we feel day to day?
Yes, and I just saw Denise popped in the chat there. She recommends Atomic Habits. So I'm happy I'm not the only one making book recommendations today. And Atomic Habits is a great title. It's by James Clear. It has been on the bestseller list since it came out. But again, he says that exact same thing, breaking it down into small. He means atomic is in the smallest particle, right?
Yeah.
So Priti loved it too. Yeah, it's a great book. The number one predictor of both our long-term health and our happiness is social connection. So above how much money we have, our age, our gender, our race, our education level, the number on a scale, anything. The number one thing is social connection. And this finding comes from, it's called the Harvard Study of it comes from multiple research studies, but the big primary one is called the Harvard Study of Adult Development. It started 87 years ago, and it actually began as two separate studies done. One was at Harvard with undergraduate male students at Harvard. And if you're wondering why only males, it was because at that time only males went to Harvard. So males. And then there was a second study that began in a lower, with men as well, in a lower socioeconomic area of Boston. And they started following them and they were measuring so much. They would do interviews, they would do blood work, very comprehensive study of these people. And then the two studies ended up merging into one study. And then they started inviting in partners and children. So now we do have a much richer data set. And this is the longest running happiness study in the world, and it's still underway. The current lead investigator, his name is Dr. Robert Waldinger, and I heard him say in April that there was only 40 participants from the original study still remaining, but they're continuing it with the family and the children. And I'm not ruining third book recommendation from me. He had a book come out in 2023, I believe, called The Good Life. And it's talking about all the findings from this study. And the punchline of the book, and I'm not ruining it, is that social connection is the thing that keeps us happiest and healthiest.
Do you have any specific advice for people that had a difficult childhood?
When we talk about, environment and things like that, and it's also the piece of the environment we were raised in, right? And the experiences that we've had. And so I think that talking to a professional to sort of unpack and process that is something that's really important. I was actually just listening to a podcast yesterday with this researcher named Scott Barry Kaufman. He just moved to Columbia University, and he just had a book come out. And I am blanking on the name, but his name is Scott Barry Kaufman. His previous book was called Transcend, which was sort of a take on Maslow's pyramid, and now it's not actually a pyramid.
And he has a great podcast as
well. He
does.
And it was on his podcast. He had Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Anxious Generation, interview him because his book had come out. And he was making a very good point about how we need to process those things. But he also said a lot of people, it sort of sounds like, I haven't read it yet, and I just got it on Audible. It sounds like a bit of a tough love conversation, where he's like, a lot of people have these experiences and it becomes their identity and their narrative, and they get caught in that and they ruminate in that, and then they don't have opportunity to redefine things. And it's not to say that hard or difficult things didn't happen, but it's about processing them. We talked about, that post-traumatic growth, all of those things, and not making our childhood define our adulthood, because, right? We can sort of rewrite part of that story. So I'm actually really excited to read that book. I haven't read it yet, but I think that, this is why we have mental health professionals and stuff. And we have our friends, and they're really great to talk to, but it's no substitute for someone that spent years, training and studying and learning. There's so many different techniques, cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, internal family systems. These are all, some really evidence-based tools that people can learn to actually make, meaningful change, and to help, rewrite that narrative, and to, build that resilience and that flourishing and that thriving.